6 categories: static clicking, dynamic clicking, smooth tracking, reactive tracking, track target switching, and flick target switching. This used to only be 3 main categories of simply tracking, clicking, and switching. One thing I've been wanting to make for a while now is a complete series on how to correctly develop technique for each aim category. Christmas Is Cancelled made a previous series that has helped a lot of people, myself included. He no longer seems to be making content, so I think it's time to do an updated version. This is going to be episode 1 in the series, and we're going to be covering static clicking. So static used to be called click timing a lot in the past. It's more accurate to simply call it clicking, and it's exactly what it describes. They're non-moving targets. In other words, they're static on the screen. In order for you to kill them, you got to click on them. What makes it different from dynamic or moving target scenarios like Pasu or Bounce 180 is there's not really any reading skills involved, or your ability to track a target and then move your mouse in order to hit the position that the target's moving toward. It's more of a benchmark for your raw click speed, tempo, precision, and your ability to micro adjust after flicking to a target. 1-wall-4TS is widely seen as the de facto standard scenario for benchmarking this skill, 4 targets being the golden number to avoid the impact of RNG for a run. TS, or small targets, are preferred by the AIM community to build up and benchmark your overall static skill because it doesn't allow you to skate by on speed alone, where larger target scenarios like 1-wall-6TE would. It forces you to bring precision and accuracy to the table along with the flick speed and the tempo. So optimal settings in Kovacs for approaching static scenarios, you generally want to use a smaller plus for a crosshair. It's easy to see against a dot. You're going to be using your crosshair as a reference point in static way more than something like reactive tracking, where you'd mostly be watching the target. For colors and background, this is preference, but since the targets don't move, it's easier to see them against a flat, high contrast background. So gray walls and black targets is a common setup, just using pure color for the backgrounds. Because static dots is essentially 2D, there's no real advantage to ensure the background helps you perceive 3D space. For your field of view or FOV, you'll mostly be on 103 Overwatch. Sometimes it helps to bump it up a bit when you're doing wide wall sends like wide wall 3 targets. Sensitivity wise, this is largely going to be preference, but static benefits from a lower sensitivity than you might normally play, anywhere from 35 to 70 cm. This gives you the best of both worlds for speed and precision, where you can use more of your shoulder and arm to flick between targets and still use your fingertip and wrist for micro adjustments with high levels of precision. Mouse control will be king here for getting high scores. You can certainly play on a higher sensitivity to increase the difficulty, or if you just have insane mouse control, but it's unlikely you'll get on the leaderboards going any higher than about 35 cm, I would say. This is just my opinion, and there's probably going to be people in the community who disagree with me on this. Like with anything in training, it just depends on what your goals are. Are you using Kovacs to just see those beautiful high scores on the leaderboards, or are you using it to supplement your FPS game? So for the technique, the main technique is best summarized by Bardos, who is arguably the best static aimer out there. There was a running joke in the AIM community to take a Bard pill to improve at static as though there was just a quick fix, but he summarized it best in this tweet. Learn the technique the same way you would an instrument. Start slow at first to get the right habits in place and build up speed over time. Proper static technique consists of 2 main parts: fast flick between the targets and a slower micro adjustment to cover the remaining distance. That's it. It's dead simple. This tweet, in my opinion, is the most optimal way to train the static technique. If you take only one thing away from my whole video, this is it. Essentially, flick fast, micro adjust slow, and reset if you miss in the first 10 seconds, reset after 4 misses total. And I think it's extremely important to hold yourself accountable to reset the scenario when you miss per Bardos' guidance. Why? Because it creates a reward system in your brain for prioritizing accuracy. Guidance. Why? It's extreme. Micro adjust slow and reset if you away from my whole video. This is it. Essentially, flick fast, micro adjust slow, and reset if you miss in the first 10 seconds, reset after 4 misses total. And I think it's extremely important to hold yourself accountable to reset the scenario when you miss per Bardos' guidance. Why? Because it creates a reward system in your brain for prioritizing accuracy. As Bardos says, the perfect run would have 100% accuracy, so it's critical to maintain accuracy as you increase your speed. As far as slow and smooth lines go, that's some of the worst advice I see about static dots, to slowly trace between targets. If you want to know why, pull up Microsoft Paint and try to draw a straight line between 2 points, slowly and then quickly. In all likelihood, the difference in mistakes you make along the way are so minor, and yet one method is vastly more quick than the other. So why go slow? As far as prioritizing speed or accuracy, a year or so ago, before Bardos entered the AIM scene, the most prominent static aimer out there was Zeke. He had most of the top scores and generally suggested prioritizing speed in order to get better scores in static. This is the actual documented message in Reddit most people use as a basis for Zeke's preferences towards speed. A lot of people try to point out that Zeke and Bardos suggest training different ways and ask, should I work on speed or accuracy on static, as though they are opposing ideas? But in my mind, Zeke and Bardos do not have conflicting ideas on static, and both precision and speed are vital to your success. There's a user in the AIM community named DRoy Light who does a great job of explaining why the fast flip plus micro adjust method of learning works so well. It's because when you're doing fast flicks, you are inviting the opportunity to create errors and learn from them. Micro adjusting is a built-in method to correct the error created from the fast flick, and over time you get better at landing closer to the target and micro adjusting more quickly when you miss the flick. So by using the Bard Pill method, you'll improve in static in the most optimal way, even if your scores are lower at first, or if it's frustrating to reset so much. If you find yourself rarely needing to micro adjust, you're likely practicing at a speed you're comfortable with. That's a good indication that you need to push yourself on speed to start introducing errors in your flicks and repeating the improvement process. That doesn't mean I recommend just aping or going all in on speed without any thought behind control. I would suggest pushing yourself about 20% on speed, get outside of your comfort zone, and when you're trying to improve your technique so you don't get fat and happy where you're at. Think of it as focusing on speed to raise the ceiling on your current skill in static and focusing on precision to hone that current skill. So is it better to under or over flick? This comes up a lot when discussing static. Zeke was the first to suggest under flicking being superior to an over flick because your momentum carries into an under flick and the inverse is not true. Christmas is canceled even went so far to create a playlist specifically geared toward training for under flicking. That said, I think people focus way too much on it, beginner and intermediate players especially. If you're at a skill level where this thing starts to matter, you don't need someone like me explaining how to get better at static dots. So I would suggest not focusing on trying to do one or the other. And definitely don't try to over or under flick. Your goal should always be to land on the target when you flick. I see this suggested sometimes and it makes me wonder what the hell people are thinking. So the common static scenario types you'll come across, one while X targets is the most common. And
today we're going to continue our aim training crash course by covering smooth tracking, and I'm going to be teaching you the proper technique so you can track like a pro. If you're new here and looking at the video, technique, when you're starting out, one of the most important things to pay attention to is over-predicting. Over-predicting is basically when you're too focused on the bot patterns and start to preemptively react to target movement changes because you're anticipating them to change direction. What you want to always focus on while training is to assume that the bot will continue in its current direction forever, then wait until you see it change direction and react back to the movement change. That way you're developing your reading and reactivity skills. And while we're on the topic of reacting back to bot movement, it's very important to react back smoothly. By that I mean not flicking too hard and landing in front of the bot like you would in a flick target switching sen. Not only does this waste movement, it will cost you some habit unlearning later on when you move into more reactive tracking. You want your reaction to the target movement changes to feel smooth and relaxed, not tense and snappy.
On tension, Aquatic is a top aimer who's going for Nova this year, and he asks I highlight this in smooth tracking, since this will have a major impact on your mouse stability. Tension refers to the force that you apply to your mouse when gripping it, and which muscles are activated will depend a lot on the sensitivity you're using. So you might not notice how tensely you're holding the mouse until you start using higher sensitivities, and become jittery because you're simply gripping the mouse too tensely. So while you're aim training, you want to consciously think about keeping your mouse hand as neutral as possible. A recommended technique is to rebind your mouse 1 to something else like spacebar, so you could feel what a completely neutral position is like in your mouse hand, and then always strive to attain that level of tension, consciously thinking about it when you're aim training. I've also heard people suggest visualizing that you're holding something extremely fragile, like an egg or very thin glass, so you subconsciously hold your mouse delicately because you're worried the thing you're holding will break. Aquatic also suggests if you notice you're tensing in the middle of aim training, don't just restart the scenario, but actively think about relaxing the tension while you're playing the scenario. Over time, this will become more reflexive, meaning it's something that you'll do automatically. But especially at first, or when you're reviewing how to improve at smoothness, think about how tensely you are holding the mouse and how you can minimize it.
You also want to be watching the bot and not your crosshair pretty much always when doing smooth tracking. This is because you're partly developing your reading skills, which is essentially your ability to understand how a target is going to move on screen and react accordingly with your crosshair movement. Remember before how I mentioned crosshair uptime? Let's expand on that a bit. When you're training, you want to be prioritizing keeping your crosshair on the target even when it feels jittery. I see way too often players that are slightly in front of or behind the target and still following the same pattern and direction the bot's moving, even though they're not doing damage to it. What you want to do is pay attention to when your crosshair falls off the bot and micro-correct to bring it back. This is especially true in scenarios like Popcorn Good at Tracking Invincible, also known as PGTI, or Smoothbot that have frequent velocity and angle changes. On the topic of resetting your mouse, due to the nature of smooth tracking sends, you're going to be encountering mouse resetting more than the other scenarios. By that we mean physically picking up your mouse to bring it back near the center of your pad when you run out of space. Resetting your mouse is not inherently bad. It happens, and learning how to properly reset your mouse quickly is a skill that you need to develop, because it will happen in firefights, and a good reset can mean the difference between winning and losing. There's two considerations here. One is try not to over reset just because you're on a part of your pad that you're not comfortable with. You want to get comfortable with parts of your pad, wrist, and arm that you aren't used to using. That's why you're aim training. The second is try to reset at the time when it is optimal, like when the bot pattern is the least viable. Remember when we talked about viability in other crash course videos? If not, make sure to go back and check those out. Basically, when the target is really difficult to hit anyways, like when its velocity is at its max or near the bottom of the arc with an arcing bot, that's when you want to prioritize resetting your mouse. That's pretty much it for technique with smoothness. This is a really straightforward mechanic that's difficult to master and just requires putting a lot of reps in. So to sum up, don't over predict. Assume the bot will keep going in its current direction forever, then react back when it changes direction. Pay attention to the bot and not the crosshair to build your reading skills. Focus on smoothly reacting back to bot changes. Prioritize crosshair uptime, micro-correcting when your crosshair falls off the target. Allow yourself to be comfortable with parts of your pad you're not used to, and focus on mouse resetting at optimal times. So now I'll be going through each of the types of tracking scenarios available on AIM trainers, which ones are useful to focus on, and what they help develop in your technique. I'm mostly going to be focusing on what I call big compound scenarios that are either very effective at what they isolate or are able to develop multiple adjacent techniques simultaneously. One important thing to note, in KovaaX especially, there's a lot of variations of these scenarios. To increase the difficulty, you could choose smaller bot versions of the scenarios I'm describing. How do you know when to increase difficulty? This is not a hard and fast rule, but shoot for 25 to 30% accuracy before increasing difficulty. Basically, you want to create errors and challenge yourself to the point of frustration during your learning bouts, which will cue your brain's attention to change in order to adapt and improve. On the other hand, if you want to decrease the difficulty, an easy way to do that in KovaaX is to change the timescale, which is essentially increases or decreases the bot's speed by a flat multiplier. You can change it to 0.7, for example, if it's too difficult at the default number of 1. There doesn't seem to be a way to do this yet in AimLab, so you can just look for easy versions of the scenarios. For the AimLab scenarios I'll be covering, easiest way to get to them in AimLab is to just use Control F to find and type in the name or part of the name of the scenario. So the first type is one plane tracking, like horizontal or vertical tracking. Generally, these are predictable long strafes that help you focus exclusively on minimizing jitter on whichever bot direction you want. These will focus far less on your reading skills and more on your raw ability to consistently keep up with the bot movement and prevent your crosshair from falling off the target. When you're playing these, prioritize thinking about keeping your crosshair on the target center mass as you're following the strafe pattern, and consciously remind yourself to move the crosshair smoothly back to the target whenever it falls off. In KovaaX, you'll commonly see scenarios like centering, smooth your wrist, vertical long strafes, thin gauntlet. I think that revolving tracking is one of the best scenarios per unit time to work on for horizontal, vertical smoothness popcorn, and vertical smooth Lapu for vertical training. In AimLab, look for scenarios like VT thin gauntlet AIO, and RA thin aiming long invincible, and RA popcorn vertical smoothness. The next type is XY tracking. You'll want to graduate to these scenarios as soon as possible, and it's a very wide area, so I've broken them into different subgroups. The XY in this instance refers to the fact that bots will be moving across at least 2 dimensions, sometimes 3 depending on the scenario. These are some of the most beneficial scenario types you can train on because the bots are difficult to predict and require constant micro adjustments to stay on target. I've been learning a lot about how to optimize skill learning, and one of the mantras repeated is density of reps per unit time, meaning the more repetitions you can execute during a learning bout, especially as you're starting out learning a skill, in this case aim training, the faster you learn the skill. And due to the bot physics and XY scenarios, you will be getting the most amount of dense reps in with these. So you've got the parabola type, probably the most famous or infamous scenario in this is Popcorn Good at Tracking Invincible, or PGTI. The AimLab version of this is called Minisphere Voltaic, arguably one of the most useful aim training scenarios ever made. This features an arcing bot with very awkward angles near the peak of the jump. If you can withstand the frustration of this scenario, this will be one of the most useful ones that you can play. Bounce 180 Ti is in the same vein. In KovaaX, there's tons of variations of this scenario, another extremely useful type. You'll find Bounce 180 Ti, also known as B180 Ti, in AimLab as well, but the same name. I also sometimes see it listed as Arc 180 Ti and RA Bounce Track. The next type is what I just call spheres, which is mostly Smooth Sphere and Control Sphere, two of the best smoothest scenarios that you can train on. I'd also lump the Pass You Track Invincible scenarios into this category. In AimLab, you'll see both Smooth and Control Sphere with the same name. RA also has a version called Precise Sphere, which is sort of a mix between Control and Smooth Sphere, and I really love that scenario. I kind of wish it was in KovaaX. Smooth Sphere features a longer strafe pattern and more arm focus, while Control focuses more on shorter strafes to focus more on wrist and fingertip movements. Pass You Track is more a predictable bot pattern and features more of a diagonal movement with a brief pause between strafes. You'll see tons of variations of the scenario in KovaaX. In AimLab, you'll just see it listed as MPXY Invincible. Smoothbot's next. It has an interesting history. It came into prominence back when Sparky, at the time, it's now known as Voltaic, used Thin Gauntlet V2 as a tracking bench, and the community realized that people were gaming the scenario with super low sensitivities instead of actually focusing on improving their aim. Smoothbot then became the de facto replacement, which is much harder to cheese and forces you to develop technique. It features a bot with wide velocity swings, requiring you to use a lot of your mouse pad, and if you try to use a low sens to minimize jitter, you won't be able to keep up with the bot. It's one of the best smooth track sends to work on. In KovaaX, there's tons of variants. In AimLab, you'll see it listed with the same name or as Smooth Pill. The last XY type is Glider, and if you've ever played Fortnite, this will be familiar to you, as it replicates the glider you use when landing in that game. It features a smaller, difficult to hit bot with a smooth horizontal strafe, starting high up in the sky and slowly drifting back down to the ground. Not only is this a very practical situation to train, it's excellent for developing your smooth tracking technique. My favorite version in KovaaX is a pure glider version. You want to focus on aiming for the head to maximize your score, and the only version I can find in AimLab currently is RA Glider Track. The last smooth track scenario type is what I call reactive smoothness. These are the scenarios where you start to question whether it falls into reactive territory due to the frequent bot changes, but they serve as an excellent bridge to bring smoothness into reactivity, which is incredibly important to develop proper technique. Probably the most important scenario you can play is smooth thin strafes, aka needle track strafing in AimLab. The important technique to focus on is smoothly reacting back to bot changes. And what makes this scenario so fantastic is its unpredictable strafe pattern, mixing in a combination of long and short strafes. This helps you avoid predicting and forces you to develop smooth reactions to bot changes. Gord is a top aimer, and someone I quote a lot, and she refers to proper technique as decelerating and re-accelerating. So instead of quickly flicking to the bot's change in movement, think of it more as decelerating when approaching the target and accelerating after approaching the target. If you spend a lot of time on static but avoided smoothness and tracking in general, this will be a difficult habit to get into, since reading isn't involved in static at all, and your first inclination will probably be to flick fast when the bot changes direction. Another great scenario to practice reactive smoothness is Air Angelic 4 Voltaic, also known as Angelic Sphere Voltaic in AimLab. Both of these will be fairly easy to find if you run Voltaic benches, since they are a benchmark scenario. Same technique and characteristic as smooth thin strafes, this just has XY movement and more frequent strafing. As a bonus in Kovacs at least, there's the other category for specialized smoothness practice. Things like Oblique and KVA, which features bots that quickly strafe at odd angles and perspectives, intended to replicate the experience of mid-range strafing in FPS games. Or Circle Smoothness, which, you guessed it, features bots that goes in circles of varying sizes. If I had to make a list of all the best smooth track scenarios to work on, it would be Smooth Thin Strafes, Smooth Sphere, Control Sphere, Pure Glider, Smooth Bot, PGTI, and Revolving Tracking. Maybe throw in Bounce 180 Ti and Popcorn Vertical Smoothness for good measure. Doing all of these will give you full coverage of all the smoothness tracking acuity you need for FPS games. This section on routines is going to primarily focus on Kovacs. Unfortunately, the equivalent playlist feature in AimLab is extremely limited and buggy, and there's just not a lot of playlists out there yet. But where applicable, I am going to discuss the equivalent AimLab custom scenarios you can run. One thing you could do is check out the latest Voltaic Fundamental AimLab routines. They have a detailed routine list ranging from absolute beginner to around intermediate, and they'll be putting out advanced routines later. All the routines I'll be covering can be run in a 1x1 fashion, meaning you can run each scenario once and run the routine multiple times, and you can just play them in total random order. The first routine, definitely the most popular and well-known, is Pure G Smoothness, and with good reason. It's a phenomenal routine with pretty much full coverage of all the smoothness types I just described. It's got centering and vertical smoothness popcorn, it's got smooth bot, it's got gliders, bounce 180 tracking invincible, it has the hardest thin gauntlet bots. It's got it all really. Two of the best scenarios in Kovacs are on this playlist, TAM, Target, Switch, Smooth, and Control. These are also available in AimLab, by the way. They feature the same bot pattern as Smooth and Control Sphere, except they have bots that regenerate health, and there's more targets to choose from, so it's more akin to a target switching scenario. If you're going to run one smoothness routine only, this is the one for you. Note that there are multiple variants of this routine, basically just increasing or decreasing the difficulty, so I'll provide share codes and Kovacs in the YouTube description for all of them. Next you have Lapu, who put together some great smoothness routines. He's a grandmaster in Kovacs with over 3,000 hours in aim trainers and counting, and is just really good at putting together succinct and effective routines. There's two main routines he put together, each having 3 difficulties of easy, medium, hard, which essentially just features smaller bots with the harder versions. The first one is titled Varied, and you guessed it, it has a variety of smoothness scenarios. I just covered my opinion on best in breed smoothness sends, and the Varied routine has pretty much all of them, so just run this if you want all of the best compound scenarios. Good news is nearly all of these scenarios are also available in AimLab. They're just that good. The XY routine he put together includes the KVA and circle track scenarios I mentioned earlier. They are interesting and fun to play, not to mention cover aim components you don't often see featured. I really like the smooth vert and vert smooth scenarios for having unusual momentum swings. They feel buttery to play and help prevent you from zoning out while training. Finally, the pass-through track smooth is excellent for smoothness training in all directions without feeling too much like a pass-through training scenario. Voltaic smoothness routine is also quite good. They have an easy and intermediate version which generally feature variations of the same scenario types we've already covered. The exception being they focus a lot more on air type bot movement and smaller, more precise dots, like with the DDTV XYZ scenarios, which are fantastic for building up your wrist smoothness. If pure density of similar scenarios are your thing, look no further than Fallen smoothness routines. They feature tons of variations of most of the scenarios we've already discussed, intended to be played in a 1x1 fashion. He suggests running them at 1.1 to 1.3 times your normal sensitivity, similar to what we discussed earlier on my section of settings. It's not a rid video without a common mistakes section. So the first is overtraining smoothness. This was super prevalent in the AIM community to just diagnose every single VOD review as a smoothness problem. Unclean lines and static, smoothness. Slow target switches, smoothness. Poor reading skills and reactive tracking, strangely also smoothness. Don't get me wrong, training smoothness is extremely important, but it's not the answer to every problem. The primary indicator for smoothness problems is if you're tracking a target with a semi-auto gun for a few seconds and you notice a lot of jitter, or your crosshair keeps falling off the target. Next is to get caught up on the exact sensitivity that you should use using training. I get this question all the time. There's really two main reasons why you would want to increase your sensitivity. One is to make target tracking more difficult. Why does it become more difficult? That leads into the second reason. Because when you increase your sense, you're naturally going to use more of your wrist and your fingertips to control the mouse. If you look at the composition of your arm, the larger muscle groupings, nerves, tendons, more associated with stability are closer to your shoulder. The smaller ones, more associated with control, are closer to your wrist. This is just science. If you're facing a predictable moving target, then using more of your upper arm and shoulder will make your shots more reliable. So you would want to increase your sensitivity to intentionally develop the muscles and nerves in your wrist that are required for aim. Next is not smoothly reacting back. If I had to name the most difficult problem aimers face and FPS players in general, it would be their inability to smoothly react to targets changing direction. Hell, I suffer from this problem to this day. I don't think it's ever something you can completely solve, because in FPS games you deal with a lot of unique strafe patterns, movement prediction, and hand interdependence, which are naturally at odds with developing smoothly reacting. So I think this is just something you need to always be aware of and try to minimize. As I mentioned before, smooth thin strafes, also known as needle track strafing in AimLab, is probably the best scenario to train on for focusing this. But generically, any smooth tracking scenario with some amount of reactivity, and especially variable strafe patterns like VSS scenarios in Kovacs, they're excellent for focusing on this. Over-predicting, this is probably the most common problem people have when doing smooth tracking, especially when they're starting out. It's counterintuitive, sort of like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time, but it's something if you consciously think about while you are training and working on eliminating it, over time you'll improve at it. Similar to the smooth reacting problem, this is a problem that will continue to show up throughout all your aim journeys, so just be aware of it when it's happening and then force yourself not to do it. And now we've reached the end of our smooth tracking journey. Make sure to invest time in the scenarios and routines that we talked about, and you too will be able to one-clip people in games. Next up in the foundational aim series will be evasive target switching, which requires a good amount of smooth tracking, so get your practice in now before we move on to that topic. I'll see you next time.
Accuracy on like a smooth bot. Now you need to start working on some more reactive or thinner bots so that you can keep improving. Oh, I got a comment from Theo, who is actually a pretty prominent figure in the Revaset community, makes a ton of great scenarios. Hi, I'm Rid. I make content about aim improvement in FPS games, usually related to using Kovacs FPS Aim Trainer. If you're new to the channel, I'm kind of known for making overly detailed guides that go into. So for the technique, the main technique is best summarized by Bardos, who is arguably the best static aimer out there. There was a running joke in the aim community to take a Bard pill to improve at static as though there was just a quick fix, but he summarized it best in this tweet. Learn the technique the same way you would an instrument. Start slow at first to get the right habits in place and build up speed over time. Proper static technique consists of two main parts: fast flick between the targets and a slower micro adjustment to cover the remaining distance. That's it. It's dead simple. This tweet, in my opinion, is the most optimal way to train the static technique. If you take only one thing away from my whole video, this is it. Essentially, flick fast, micro adjust slow, and reset if you miss in the first 10 seconds, reset after 4 misses total. And I think it's extremely important to hold yourself accountable to reset the scenario when you miss per Bardos' guidance. Why? Because it creates a reward system in your brain for prioritizing accuracy. As Bardos says, the perfect run would have 100% accuracy, so it's critical to maintain accuracy as you increase your speed. As far as slow and smooth lines go, that's some of the worst advice I see about static dots, to slowly trace between targets. If you want to know why, pull up Microsoft Paint and try to draw a straight line between 2 points, slowly and then quickly. In all likelihood, the difference in mistakes you make along the way are so minor, and yet one method is vastly more quick than the other. So why go slow? As far as prioritizing speed or accuracy, a year or so ago, before Bardos entered the aim scene, the most prominent static aimer out there was Zeke. He had most of the top scores and generally suggested prioritizing speed in order to get better scores in static. This is the actual documented message in Reddit most people use as a basis for Zeke's preferences towards speed. A lot of people try to point out that Zeke and Bardos suggest training different ways and ask, should I work on speed or accuracy on static, as though they are opposing ideas. But in my mind, Zeke and Bardos do not have conflicting ideas on static, and both precision and speed are vital to your success. There's a user in the aim community named DRoy Light who does a great job of explaining why the fast flick plus micro adjust method of learning works so well. It's because when you're doing fast flicks, you are inviting the opportunity to create errors and learn from them. Micro adjusting is a built-in method to correct the error created from the fast flick, and over time you get better at landing closer to the target and micro adjusting more quickly when you miss the flick. So by using the Bard pill method, you'll improve in static in the most optimal way, even if your scores are lower at first, or if it's frustrating to reset so much. If you find yourself rarely needing to micro adjust, you're likely practicing at a speed you're comfortable with. That's a good indication that you need to push yourself on speed to start introducing errors in your flicks and repeating the improvement improvement process. That doesn't mean I recommend just aping or going all in on speed without any thought behind control. I would suggest pushing yourself about 20% on speed, get outside of your comfort zone, and when you're trying to improve your technique so you don't get fat and happy where you're at. Think of it as focusing on speed to raise the ceiling on your current skill in static and focusing on precision to hone that current skill. So is it better to under or over flick? This comes up a lot when discussing static. Zeke was the first to suggest underflicking being superior to an overflick because your momentum carries into an underflick and the inverse is not true. Christmas Cancelled even went so far to create a playlist specifically geared toward training for underflicking. That said, I think people focus way too much on it, beginner and intermediate players especially. If you're at a skill level where this thing starts to matter, you don't need someone like me explaining how to get better at static dots. So I would suggest not focusing on trying to do one or the other. And definitely don't try to over or under flick. Your goal should always be to land on the target when you flick. I see this suggested sometimes and it makes me wonder what the hell people are thinking. So the common static scenario types you'll come across, one wall X targets is the most common, and that's things like one wall 4 targets, one wall 6 targets, one wall 2 targets, and tons of variations of those with smaller or larger bots. And then you've got the wide wall scenarios. Again, wide wall X targets, which prioritize spacing the targets much further apart than the common one wall X targets, which forces you to use larger angles when you're flicking. You've got varied, which is becoming popular, and that is more like a time attack scenario. It's start you out with larger bots, and then over time in the scenario, you start getting smaller and smaller bots until they just totally disappear. Then you've got the hipfire and micro flick type scenarios. Those have smaller targets that are in clusters, and they prioritize your wrist movements and your micro flicking techniques. Pokeball is a really popular static type. You'll see it in all kinds of different variations, and it is a common recommendation to force you to work on your precision because it features bots that have a small amount of health that regenerates, so you can't just quickly move off of it after flicking to it. And then you've got the pressure sends, which are a higher difficulty type sends. If you've never run them before, you're in for a treat. They can be very challenging, especially for newer players, but they're some of the best ways to push yourself on speed while staying precise. As far as target sizes go, you generally don't want to train on bigger than TS size. You'll see a lot of variants of scenarios like 30% smaller, small, extra small for every scenario type. Smaller targets obviously increase the difficulty and prioritize precision and mouse control. Larger targets will generally prioritize speed. As far as routines go, static routines, they benefit from being run in a 1x1 fashion, in my opinion. I recommend integrating the Bard Pill method when you're running the static routines, and it might take you 10 minutes to get through a single scenario. Most likely you'll get stuck, so I would suggest running these routines for about an hour, doing Bard Pill for about 30 minutes, then switching to just regular training to get you through the routine. You can run these routines in total random, and if you don't get through the whole routine, that's generally fine. After all, you're working on your static technique. For beginners, the Voltaic Static Easy 1x1 is a fantastic routine. It's a great compilation of all the different types of static scenarios you'll want to practice on. You could just play this routine if it doesn't get stale for you in a 1x1 method until GM if you wanted, and still benefit from it. Getting into the intermediate and advanced, Voltaic has a static advanced 1x1, which is similar to the beginner, but then it starts to integrate the pressure scenarios, which, as I said before, they're more advanced and difficult for newer players, and they prioritize speed and accuracy. Eerie Cold 1x1. Eerie Cold, he's one of the top static aimers out there, and he's known for his excellent playlists across the spectrum. You'll see most of the same types of scenarios like what you would see in the Voltaic Static Advanced, and this is a common theme with static scenarios because they're fairly straightforward, and most of the best top scenarios have been figured out already. Trust Mix. Trust recently emerged as a top tier static aimer. He's competing with Bardos on most of the static leaderboards. As of recording this video, he just won first place in a major aim lab tournament for $35,000, just to give you an idea of how good this guy is. And he built a routine around improving at 1x6 target small specifically, but I think it's good for overall static improvement. You can run the routine as he built it, or you can just run it in a 1x1 fashion. Unan's flick accuracy. This is one I recommend a lot. Unan's has long been one of the best target switches out there, and he's known for his insane mouse speed. As it happens, static target switch requires a lot of the same skills that static clicking requires. And if speed is your bottleneck for static, as it is with a lot of people, you can use his speed and flick accuracy routine. And remember, in target switch scenarios, you'll be running at a higher FOV. Anywhere between 115 and 125 Overwatch is preferred. Gord also put together a speed routine recently. She's probably unknown to most people watching this video, but she's been a top aimer for a while now and recently has been contributing more and more to the community with routines which are excellent. This routine that she put out is again geared more toward target switching, but it'll help you develop your overall mouse speed to get better scores in static. She suggests to run this in total randomize and at 115 FOV for box and 125 FOV for PAT TS scenarios. Compared to the Unan's routines, this features bigger targets, which is good for training raw speed, but less effective for speed and precision combined. Which is more important to you will depend where your weaknesses lie, but in my opinion, chances are if you're not top 100 in popular static scenarios, you're probably not moving your hand fast enough. So other general notes, if you have difficulty holding yourself accountable to the Bard Pill method, some people have made Bard Pill versions of the popular static scenarios. You can just search for Bard Pill in Kovacs. Try them out. Basically, they just reset after 4 misses for you automatically. Raspberry is also somebody who's recently come into prominence in the AIM community as one of the best map makers out there. He's built some excellent static scenarios with unique mechanics that are meant to help optimize improvement. One type is called VBR, which includes bots that vibrate slightly to enforce precision requirements. And the first time you're playing it, you might think you're hallucinating, but no, the bots are actually moving very slightly. It also adds a small amount of time to the run when you kill the bots and has a 4-bullet mag with a really long reload time. It's essentially using the Bard Pill method in a creative way. This combination of characteristics rewards speed and tempo with a softer penalty for accuracy along the way. That way, if you're having a really good tempo-based run, you can keep running with it, and there's still the guardrails in place when you're missing shots. The other scenario type that he recently built is his take on 1x6 target small, called 1x5 target small, which uses a square root accuracy system instead of a linear accuracy penalty. I actually asked him about why he thinks this is effective, and here's what he had to say. Obviously, the guy's passionate about aiming, so am I, so great minds think alike. The TLDR is square root accuracy is the superior bridge between reload and normal accuracy scenarios because it doesn't interrupt your rhythm and tempo while still having soft penalties in place for having poor accuracy. In his eyes, and I agree with this, you want to allow yourself the space to feel in the zone and ideally extend that as much as possible and avoid flow interruptions like coming up to the end of a timer or dealing with a reload. Now, if you watch pro aimers doing their runs, you'll notice they have a pretty solid and fast tempo they strive to hold themselves accountable to. Especially noticeable in wide wall scenarios, they'll try to hit a far target target as quickly as a close one, so flick speed is crucial. Avoid going back to confirm targets if you miss the first time. I see this a lot, especially with newer players, where they create a habit that every target has to die and go back if they miss. If you miss, move on. It's more important to keep your tempo going. And don't overemphasize smoothness training as your one solution for all jitter or lack of clean lines. Smoothness routines are very specific to tracking and your ability to maintain your crosshair on your target as you're tracking the movement over a long period of time. I see it often suggested as a remedy in static if you don't have clean lines between targets, like if you swoop around or don't flick accuracy. This is going to just get better with time as you improve your static technique using the Bard Pill method. Don't think that smoothness applies to literally everything, because it doesn't. And try to avoid more than 2 distinct movements when you're moving from target to target. It's better to way over or under flick than to break up your flick into 3 or 4 movements. So that's really all I had for this video. I hope that all of this was helpful to you. Even though static dots are fairly straightforward in terms of how you should approach the technique, there's obviously a lot of nuance and ground to cover, hence the link of the video. I wanted this to be a comprehensive guide that stands the test of time. So again, this is going to be part 1 of 6 in the series, so look out for the next one. And until then, I wish you luck on all of your PDs.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I am going to try to do something a little bit different today. After I released my last video on static dots, I took a vacation for a week, and I tried to keep up on the comments as much as possible. I think I finally got through everything, but I figured I'd do something a little different this time and actually go through each of the comments that I got and kind of talk about my thought process behind justifying, the answers. One of the most common feedback I get is 2 different things. One is make more content. Yes, I know I try to make as much content as humanly possible. I do work full time. The other is people seem to like when I go into depth about things. This is something I struggle with internally, is how can I release content that's meaningful and succinct, but also go into detail. And, I have a kind of like a variety of an audience there. So this is going to be really me just talking through. I'm going to try to get
The way that you are training and learning is wrong. Most people are learning and training through methods that are either handed down to them through practitioner communities, which is all good, well and good, but there has been a lot of changes and advents in research in neuroscience, specifically with motor learning and how our brains work and how we actually learn and how those neural connections are created and then they're strengthened. And this has been maybe a couple decades of research. And specifically, there's been a lot of advents in like neural imaging, where we can actually see physically what's happening in our brain. We're able to actually observe it. So I didn't know any of this either, and most people don't. So I spent the past couple months really sitting down and figuring this stuff out. I'll actually show you up on the screen real quick. There's this cool site called Research Rabbit, and it lets you do, among other things, put together all of the scientific journals that get collected and kind of create webs of similar work that you can look up. So it's pretty neat. I've been using this for a little while now to kind of validate everything that I've been researching. And so there's a lot of different sources of information out there. Andrew Huberman is probably the most common one that people are familiar with. I've seen it a lot in the AIM community. I've been consuming his podcast a lot. He is an actual neuroscientist. He's a teacher at, he's a professor. He's got a PhD in ophthalmology and neuroscience. Fantastic podcast. He does a really good job of breaking down scientific and highly technical and mechanical concepts, and then helping them, help you, the layman, me, the layman, understand them, but then also create protocols. In other words, procedures that you can actually implement in your own life to make these things effective based on how these biological things work. So me, I'm an applied scientist. I do work for an educational institution. I won't say which one. I'm an engineer. I'm not a neuroscientist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't even work in biosciences. I do have a scientific researcher in my title, just because I work for an educational institution. That's how it works. So I just want to make it clear up front, I'm not an expert in this. I've been doing the very best I can to kind of coalesce all of this into a meaningful narrative, which we're going to get into. I'm going to get some things wrong, but hopefully I'm able to. One thing that I've learned over the years that I'm pretty good at is taking complex topics and then breaking them down into the core components and then describing that to other people. So, one thing that I think is very important that I noticed in the AIM community specifically, this applies to just about anything, I'm sure, but people have a tendency to take scientific research that's unpublished, or stuff that comes from maybe like a graduate student that is doing their master's or their PhD thesis, and then they publish that, and then they use that as a basis to form their opinions. I want to make it very clear up front, I'm not doing that. I am only looking at apex journals like Journal Science, Neuron, things like that are major journals that have been peer reviewed. And also I think it's very important of the quality of research, things like looking for things that are placebo controlled, They have human trials, double blind where possible. Things like that is what I really look for when I'm pulling together my research. So this isn't just, you know, some random thing that somebody put together that has actually no validity. This is stuff that has been corroborated. So I think all of those things are very important. And so what I want to talk about really quickly before I start is the format. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to describe all of these underlying mechanisms, and these are biological mechanisms. And the way you can think of these are features of how we're built as humans. In other words, they're very factual. This is just like how our biology works. And then later on, what I'm going to do is describe the protocols. And so why I think that's very important is because there's two things that I think are important there. One is it's more likely that you're going to stick to a protocol or, you know, like a training regimen, for example, if you understand why it works. At least that's the way that I work. And the second thing is you can customize it. That's one thing that I've noticed a lot is people will try to use somebody else's protocols verbatim without understanding why they work. And then when they don't work for them, they either don't know what to do or they don't know how to modify it based on why that person originally created it. So that's what I'm going to talk about, those two things distinctly. And this is not going to be a detailed dive on the studies for time purposes because it would just take forever. Like I said, I would strongly suggest if you are interested in this to start with the Andrew Huberman podcast. It's fantastic. He does a really good job of breaking this down in a very technical manner. This is going to be a 1 hour session. I think this one's going to go a little bit longer because I got to do the intro like I'm doing right now. And then, so 45 minutes and then 15-minute question at the end. So hold your questions till the end. And I would ask that, you know, use clips. That helps me if you clip something that if it resonates with you. And then if you want to share that, that'll help me out. So let's just get started. And this is my web that I have just been putting together. All right, this is stuff that I started.